It was not the kind of silence you expect in a forest. Normally, even in the darkest hours of the night, a woodland is alive with sound, the distant flutter of wings, the faint rustle of small animals navigating the undergrowth, the irregular creak of branches adjusting under the weight of the wind. The forest speaks in layers, an orchestra of life that reassures you with its familiarity. But that night, in Rendlesham Forest, the silence was wrong. It was not the absence of noise, but the presence of something else, something heavy, pressing against our ears like cotton stuffed into them. It was a silence that felt manufactured, engineered, as if the entire landscape had been muted by some invisible hand. That was when I realized we were not dealing with a routine disturbance. We were not about to stumble on a downed aircraft or chase away a trespasser. My training told me prepare for human threats. Soviet infiltrators, saboteurs, accidents involving friendly aircraft. But my instincts told me that night was different. Something far beyond my training, beyond any briefing or manual, was unfolding in front of us. And then, through the thick lattice of branches, I saw it, hovering just above the damp earth of Rendlesham Forest, framed by trees blackened against the faint starlight, was a shape both impossibly simple and utterly alien. A triangle, perfectly symmetrical, edges so sharp they seemed to blur into the night. Its surface absorbed the darkness like a sponge, and yet from beneath it emanated a glow, faint at first, then pulsing softly, as if the craft itself were breathing. Red gave way to white. White faded to a deep electric blue, and that blue shimmered like liquid light across the bark of nearby trees. I had seen aircraft before, fighters tearing across skies in drills, bombers lumbering above the clouds, even experimental prototypes whispered about in hangars. I had even glimpsed the beginnings of drones, those strange unmanned crafts that few civilians then knew existed. But nothing like this, nothing that moved this way, because it didn't move at all. It floated, not like a machine held aloft by engines, but like an idea suspended in the air, as if gravity itself had been told to wait. I froze. My boots sank half an inch into the mud, but I didn't notice. My pulse hammered in my ears, each beat a reminder that I was alive and standing in front of something that shouldn't exist. Behind me, one of my fellow airmen whispered something I barely caught. Maybe a prayer, maybe a curse. The tone said it all. This was not fear of the enemy, not fear of crossfire or bombs. This was the fear of witnessing something the world had no language for. The year was 1980. The Cold War stretched its shadow across every base, every briefing, every restless night spent under fluorescent lights and watchful radars. I was stationed at RAF Woodbridge in Suffolk, England, one of two twin bases leased to the United States Air Force. Our purpose was clear: to be the eyes and ears of NATO's frontline defense, watching for Soviet bombers that might never come, preparing for infiltration that might never happen. We drilled until our bodies obeyed faster than our minds could think. We learned procedures for crashes, for nuclear alerts, for sabotage. But none of those drills included instructions for what to do when something unearthly appeared in the woods beside our base. The night had begun without promise of anything unusual. December 26th, the day after Christmas. The holiday spirit had barely touched us. We were too far from home, too focused on duty to indulge much. I expected another quiet shift, the kind where time stretched thin and paperwork piled higher than conversation. But quiet has a way of breaking when you least expect it. Reports began trickling in, lights descending into the forest. At first, we assumed a crash. A plane gone down, maybe civilian, maybe military. Protocol dictated immediate investigation. What if it was Soviet? What if it carried technology too dangerous to leave unchecked? We couldn't afford to ignore it, so we prepared. 3 of us grabbed flashlights and sidearms, our breath fogging the bitter air as we set off into the trees. I remember the crunch of frost under my boots, the sting of cold on my cheeks, the distant hum of generators in the base fading as the forest swallowed us. Each step forward was a step away from the world we knew and deeper into something else. The forest was darker than usual. Clouds blotted out the moon, branches wove into a cage above our heads, and the ground absorbed what little light remained. Each step sounded louder than it should, twigs snapping like gunfire in the unnatural hush. As we moved deeper, the forest changed. The life of the woods, foxes, owls, even the tiniest insects, was gone. Not quiet, but absent, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I felt it before I saw it. The way you feel a storm on the horizon, pressure in the air, a faint metallic taste on your tongue, the electricity of anticipation crawling across your skin. My radio, steady moments before, hissed with bursts of static, squawking nonsense, though we were still well within range of the base. Something was interfering. Something unseen but undeniably present. Then the lights appeared. At first, they seemed like distant searchlights weaving between trunks, but no beams extended, no source revealed itself. These lights floated, self-contained, steady, deliberate. I told myself it had to be flares. Maybe some exercise we hadn't been briefed about. But flares drifted. These held their ground, fixed as if nailed to the air itself. We pushed deeper. My breath grew shallow, my fingers tight on the grip of my flashlight. And then we saw it. Breaking through a thicket, we stumbled into a small clearing. And there, in the center, the object revealed itself. No longer distant lights. No longer glimpses through branches. But whole, complete. It was not falling, not broken. It was waiting. Up close, the object defied everything I thought I knew about machines. Its triangular form was too perfect, too symmetrical, as though it had been cut from the night itself. The edges were crisp, yet they seemed to blur the longer I stared, as if the craft existed slightly out of focus with the world around it. The surface absorbed the beam of my flashlight, swallowing it like ink into paper. But from beneath the craft came that steady glow, breathing colors shifting from red to white to blue. The light wasn't projected. It was alive, like veins carrying energy through something not meant to be touched by human hands. And then there were the markings. Along one side, faint etchings ran in sharp lines like glyphs or hieroglyphs, but unlike any language I had ever seen. They were too precise, too clean, as though burned directly into the surface. At first they seemed random, but the longer I looked, the more they seemed to rearrange themselves, adjusting to my gaze. Symbols turned to patterns, patterns hinted at meaning. My brain screamed that it was impossible. Letters don't move, languages don't shift, but my eyes betrayed me. I reached out without realizing it. My gloved hand extended, fingers trembling. As I drew close, heat radiated from the surface. Not the dry burn of fire, but the charged warmth of static electricity amplified 100-fold. My fingertips tingled, the sensation prickling into my nerves as if the air itself were alive. For a heartbeat, I thought my skin would ignite. I yanked my hand back, but the feeling lingered, buzzing beneath the flesh like an imprint branded into me. Behind me, one of the men muttered a prayer. The other hissed a warning. "We need to call this in." His voice quivered, torn between duty and fear. He raised a sidearm, knuckles white around the grip. "Maybe we should fire. Test if it reacts." But instinct told me that would be a mistake. Every muscle screamed that one wrong move could erase us in an instant. The object didn't feel hostile, not yet, but it didn't feel fragile either. It felt like power restrained, potential waiting, a presence that could choose what happened next. "Don't," I whispered, my voice hoarse. If it wanted us gone, we'd already be gone. The three of us stood there, paralyzed between training and terror. Protocol said report, secure, contain. But protocol had no column for this. My heart hammered, my mind raced, yet something deeper held me still. The responsibility to witness. If we turned back now, the truth would rot into rumor. Evidence would dissolve into drunken tales, dismissed by anyone who hadn't stood in this silent clearing. So I memorized the glow on the bark of the trees, the way frost melted into thin mist near the ground beneath the craft, the silence, so complete it rang louder than noise. And then the forest itself seemed to respond. A vibration spread beneath our boots, subtle at first, then steady. Not a quake, not the shifting of earth, but a resonance, like standing on the casing of a machine too large to comprehend. The air grew thicker, every breath heavy in my chest. The markings flared, once faint, now they shone brilliant white, flooding the clearing in unnatural light. I shielded my eyes, but even behind my lids the symbols burned, searing their shapes into my mind. A pressure bloomed in my skull, not pain but intrusion, as if something were writing directly into the folds of my memory. I staggered. My knees buckled. For a moment, I thought I would collapse, but then the sensation steadied, spreading like ink and water. The symbols no longer floated before me. They floated inside me, and then it stopped. The glow dimmed. The air released its grip. The vibration faded until only my own ragged breathing remained. I gasped, sweat freezing against my skin, every nerve alight with aftershock. The others were staring at me, their faces pale, eyes wide. "What happened?" one demanded. "What did you do?" I didn't do anything," I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew they weren't true. Something had happened. Something had been done to me. I tried to speak, to explain, but language failed. How do you describe the sensation of a thought that is not your own settling into your mind? How do you explain knowledge you cannot translate, meaning without words? The others wanted to retreat. They muttered about command, about calling in reinforcements, about sealing off the forest. But deep down, I knew none of that mattered. Reinforcements would only add more eyes, more confusion. The craft wasn't something you could surround with men and weapons. It was something that decided on its own terms whether to be seen, whether to remain. I wanted to step closer again. My body ached to, though my mind screamed against it. A war waged inside me. Training versus instinct. Fear versus curiosity. Every fiber of my being told me that this was a line. One step forward, and I would cross into something I could never return from. And I realized then that my life would be divided in two, before Rendlesham and after. Because once you stand before the impossible, nothing ordinary ever feels the same again. I stood there, breath shallow, torn between instinct and duty. The forest felt less like a place of trees and soil and more like a stage, as if the world had shifted into a theater, where I was both actor and audience. The craft hovered in the clearing with a patience that was almost unnerving. It didn't drift. It didn't pulse forward. It just waited. And that was perhaps the most frightening part, that it seemed to be aware of us, aware of me, and content to let us decide our next move. One of the men with me, a tall airman named Carlson, broke the tension first. "We need to call this in," he said again, his voice firmer now, though his hands still trembled. "Command needs to know. This isn't some flare or helicopter. This is something else." The other, Ramirez, gripped his flashlight so tightly that his knuckles looked pale. "What are they going to do? Send a squad in? You think bullets will scare this thing off?" His voice cracked on the last word. Their words faded into the background as I watched the object, unable to tear my eyes from the shifting light beneath it, blue to red, red to white, then back again in a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost conversational. The longer I stared, the more it resembled breathing. Not mechanical, not artificial, but alive. Alive. The thought struck me hard, and I nearly said it aloud. What if we weren't just staring at a machine? What if it was more than metal, more than technology? What if it was something alive in its own right, an organism, a being, not a vessel? The idea both fascinated and terrified me. Carlson started fiddling with his radio again, trying to get a signal through the static. The interference was relentless, bursts of hissing and garbled tones that drowned his attempts to call base. Ramirez finally snapped. "It doesn't want us talking to them. Can't you see that? It doesn't want us calling for backup." I almost told him to shut up, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling he might be right. The interference wasn't random. It came in waves, rising and falling almost in response to our actions. The moment Carlson pressed the transmit button, the static roared louder, like a warning. We were not in control. I shifted my stance, my boots sinking deeper into the wet ground, and I asked myself a question I wasn't ready to answer. Was this a threat, or was this contact? The glow flared brighter, flooding the clearing with white light. For an instant, I could see everything. The fine mist curled along the ground, the texture of bark on nearby trees, the pale faces of my fellow airmen illuminated like ghosts. The object hummed, not loudly but low, vibrating through my ribs, resonating inside my chest like the thrum of an engine buried beneath miles of earth. Then the markings lit up again. Symbols brighter than before, no longer faint glyphs, but burning lines of light. They seared into me the way sunlight etches its outline into your vision after staring too long. Only this didn't fade. The shapes remained even when I blinked, floating behind my eyelids, imprinting themselves into my mind. Carlson stumbled back, shielding his eyes. What the hell is it doing? I don't know, I whispered, though deep inside I felt an answer forming, a wordless understanding that it wasn't attacking. It was communicating. Ramirez swore under his breath, then aimed his weapon, his nerves snapping under pressure. We can't just stand here. What if it's marking us? What if this is an attack? I grabbed his arm before he could do something stupid. Don't. If you fire, that'll be the end of all of us. He resisted for a second, his body trembling, then finally lowered the weapon, sweat dripping from his forehead despite the cold. The glow dimmed again, almost as if the craft had heard me. I can't explain the next part without sounding insane, but I know what I felt. Relief. Not mine. Theirs. The object seemed to relax, the lights pulsing slower, softer, like a heartbeat easing after exertion. For a moment, the clearing no longer felt like a trap. It felt like a meeting place. And then, without warning, a beam of light shot downward. It wasn't like a searchlight, not a narrow cone. It was a column of energy, wide enough to envelop the patch of ground between us. The soil glistened under it, frost evaporating in tiny curls of steam. My skin prickled with heat, though the air remained icy cold. The beam pulsed once, twice, then flickered out. When it did, something remained. On the ground where the beam had touched, the frost was gone, and etched into the soil was a shape, a perfect triangle, mirroring the craft above. Inside the triangle were smaller markings, jagged lines and arcs that echoed the glyphs on the side of the craft. We stared at it in silence. A message? A signature? A warning? I crouched to get a closer look, though my body screamed at me to keep distance. The lines glowed faintly, as though the soil itself had been burned not by fire, but by pure energy. My hand hovered above the triangle, and once again I felt that static surge, buzzing in my fingertips like electricity leaping to greet me. Ramirez shook his head furiously. We're not supposed to be here. We need to leave. Now. Carlson agreed. We should at least report this. Whatever it is, we're out of our depth. But I couldn't move. Not yet. Because I knew, with a certainty I couldn't explain, that this was intentional. That the craft wanted us to see. That the mark on the ground was no accident. I lifted my eyes back to the hovering object, and in that moment the lights shifted again. The red and white glow became steady blue, softer, calmer. The humming faded into silence. The craft seemed almost satisfied, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, it began to rise. Slow at first, then faster, the triangular shape lifted into the night sky. It didn't tilt or bank like an aircraft. It simply ascended, as though weightless. Within seconds, it cleared the treetops. The glow grew smaller, shrinking into the heavens until only the faintest point of light remained. Then it vanished entirely. The forest fell silent once more, but it wasn't the silence of before. This was emptier, hollower, like the absence left behind after something vast departs. The three of us stood there, frozen, unable to speak. Finally, Ramirez broke the silence with a single word. Gone. But we knew better. It hadn't gone. It had chosen to leave. And what it left behind in the clearing, the burned triangle, the etched glyphs, and the seared memory in our minds, was proof enough that it could return whenever it wished. When the craft vanished into the sky, we were left staring at the empty clearing like men abandoned by reality itself. My breath steamed in the cold air, chest still heaving from tension I hadn't released. The forest seemed to exhale with us, branches creaking, a wind finally moving again, as if life itself had been paused and only now dared to resume. Carlson rubbed his temples. I don't know what to write in a report about this. His voice cracked like someone waking from a nightmare they weren't sure had ended. Ramirez paced in tight circles, flashlight beam bouncing erratically across the ground. We can't tell anyone. No one's going to believe it. They'll say we were drunk, or seeing things. And if they do believe us, they'll bury us with questions we can't answer. But the ground between us told another story. The burned triangle glowed faintly, impossible to ignore. Its lines shimmered like embers, etched so perfectly into the frostless soil that no trick of light or human hand could explain them away. I crouched again to study it. The markings inside the triangle seemed to shift faintly, still alive with residual heat. I reached out my hand, hesitant, stopping inches above the surface. That same static prickle leapt into my fingers, buzzing through nerves as though the triangle recognized me. I pulled back quickly, shaken. "This isn't going anywhere," I said quietly. "We can't just walk away and pretend we didn't see it. Someone will find it. Someone will ask questions." Carlson swallowed hard. "Then command has to know." He hesitated. "But you know what happens if we tell them exactly what we saw." We did know. Rumors traveled fast in bases like ours. Men who reported strange lights, radar anomalies, things that couldn't be explained. They were reassigned, ridiculed, sometimes quietly removed. The Cold War demanded certainty, and there was no room for soldiers who carried uncertainty in their eyes. Ramirez stopped pacing and turned to us. "Then we don't say what it was. We just reported disturbance. Lights. Strange interference. That's all." The thought of reducing what we had just seen, the hovering craft, the shifting glyphs, the surge of something written directly into my mind, to a line in a report about strange lights felt like betrayal. But what choice did we have? If we told the truth, we risked everything. If we lied, the truth would vanish into silence. We made our way back to the base, flashlights cutting paths through the dark forest. None of us spoke much. Every so often, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the blue glow return, half hoping it would. But the forest stayed dark, alive again with ordinary sounds. An owl calling, branches snapping under small paws. Life had returned, but we had crossed into something beyond it. Back at Woodbridge, the questioning began immediately. The duty officer demanded details. Why we left our post, why we ventured so deep into the forest, what had we seen? We exchanged glances, silently agreeing on the story before words left our mouths. "Lights in the woods," Carlson said flatly. "Possible aircraft down." We investigated. Found nothing. The officer's eyes narrowed. "And the interference on the radio?" Ramirez shrugged. "Could have been atmospheric. Static buildup. Winter does that sometimes." I stayed quiet as much as I could, answering only when pressed. My throat felt dry, my head still buzzing with images of shifting glyphs. I wondered if they could see in my eyes that something had been written into me. The officer scribbled notes, unimpressed. He dismissed us eventually, muttering about filing it with routine incidents. Just like that, the truth had been sealed in a manila folder, stripped of its weight, reduced to a handful of sterile words. But the story didn't end there. The next night, whispers spread through the barracks. Others had seen lights too. Security patrols near Bentwaters, the sister base, reported strange orbs drifting over the tree-line. Some swore they saw beams of light piercing the ground, like searchlights without sources. One man claimed the beam touched down near a weapons storage area. His voice shook when he told it, eyes darting like prey sensing hunters. I listened without speaking. My mind replayed the triangle etched into the soil, the heat, the hum in my chest. This wasn't a single encounter. It was a presence, something moving deliberately across our territory, choosing where to appear, who to show itself to. Sleep became impossible. Every creak of the barracks made me sit up. Every flicker on the horizon pulled me to the window. My nerves frayed, stretched thin between fear and an inexplicable longing to see it again. And then came the strangest change. Dreams. At first, they were fragments, symbols glowing in the dark, triangles spinning like constellations, light pulsing like a heartbeat. But then they grew clearer. I saw the glyphs arranging themselves into patterns, shifting as though trying to teach me a language I couldn't yet grasp. I woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the images etched deeper each time. I didn't tell Carlson or Ramirez. They were already shaken, barely holding themselves together. To admit that the encounter was following me into my sleep would have broken them. But I couldn't deny it. Something had stayed with me. The dreams didn't stop. If anything, they grew stronger with each passing night. By the end of that week, I no longer woke in confusion. I woke in certainty, with symbols burned into my vision even after opening my eyes. They weren't random. They were instructions. Or maybe memories, not mine but gifted or forced, into me during the day. I tried to function as normal. Drills, patrols, reports. But my focus slipped. I'd find myself staring at radar screens too long, seeing shapes that weren't there. I caught myself tracing patterns into the margins of my notepad. Triangles inside triangles, arcs connected by lines. The same glyphs in the craft, unbidden, flowing from my hand like I'd always known them. Carlson noticed first. "You're not sleeping," he said one morning, his voice low so others wouldn't hear. His eyes searched mine. "Are you still thinking about that night?" I lied, because what else could I do? Not really. Just shaken up. Same as you. But I could tell he didn't believe me. Ramirez avoided me altogether. He wanted to bury the experience, pretend it hadn't happened. When others whispered about strange lights or radio static, he left the room. He was unraveling in his own way, and I didn't blame him. Some truths are too heavy to carry, and denial becomes the only shield. Yet the truth wouldn't leave me. 2 nights after the encounter, I returned to the forest alone. I told myself I just wanted fresh air, but my boots carried me straight to the clearing without hesitation. The triangle was still there, burned into the soil, though fainter now. The lines glowed less, like embers cooling, but when I knelt beside it, I felt the same hum in my chest. And then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The pattern had changed. The inner markings weren't the same as before. They had rearranged, forming new arcs and angles, like a message updating itself. The ground wasn't just scarred. It was alive, rewriting itself long after the craft had gone. I froze, staring, heart hammering in my ears. My breath fogged in the freezing air. Was it waiting for me? Responding to me? The radio on my belt hissed again, static cutting through the silence. No one was on the line, yet the noise came in pulses, like a signal coded into sound. For a moment, I thought I understood it. Not words, but intent. I backed away, my boots crunching on frost. The forest seemed to lean closer, branches creaking like listening ears. When I returned to base, I didn't tell a soul. How could I? Who would believe that the soil itself was still speaking, days after craft had gone? Weeks passed. Officially, nothing more happened. Reports of lights were dismissed as stars. Patrolmen reassigned when their stories grew too insistent. Life at the base returned to its cold routines. But for me, nothing was the same. The dreams became visions. Waking or sleeping, the glyphs hovered behind my eyes. Sometimes they formed patterns so complex I couldn't follow them. Other times they resolved into something almost familiar, maps maybe, or blueprint of places I didn't recognize. I started keeping a notebook under my pillow, scribbling them down before they faded. I couldn't stop. And here's the strangest part. The more I drew, the calmer I felt. It was as though writing them was part of the process, like emptying a vessel too full. But each page I filled left me with a gnawing sense that I wasn't just recording. I was participating. Years later, long after I left the service, I still keep that notebook. Its pages are filled with triangles, arcs, symbols that no linguist could decipher. I've shown them to no one, not because I'm afraid of ridicule, but because I'm afraid someone might understand. Sometimes, late at night, I still wake with that hum in my chest, the vibration that began in a silent clearing in Rendlesham Forest. And I wonder if that night was an accident at all. What if the craft wanted to be seen? What if it chose us, 3 men standing guard on a cold December night? Not as witnesses, but as messengers. I often ask myself this question, and now I ask it of you. If something beyond this world handed you a fragment of knowledge you couldn't explain, would you share it? Or would you bury it, afraid of what it might mean? I chose silence. But silence doesn't erase memory. It only isolates it. And that's why I'm telling you this now, decades later, with my hair gray and my hands unsteady. Because the truth I carry is too heavy to take to the grave. Because the world deserves to know that in 1980, in a forest in Suffolk, something impossible happened. Something hovered above the earth, breathing light into the night, etching symbols into soil and mind alike. And it never really left. Because once you have seen the impossible, it becomes part of you, and Rendlesham will never leave me. The first time the symbols burned into my mind, I thought it was nothing more than shock. My hand hovered only inches from the surface of that craft when they blazed alive, glowing so intensely I had to squint. Yet, strangely, they didn't blind me. It was as if the light bypassed my eyes altogether, embedding itself directly into me. The sensation wasn't like sight. It was like memory being written in real time, as though the symbols weren't meant to be read but absorbed. The glyphs twisted, rearranged, folding into one another like pieces of a puzzle that never stayed solved. Each time I thought I recognized a pattern, it changed again, slipping out of reach. I couldn't decipher them, but I felt them. They left behind a resonance, a weight inside me, as if meaning itself had been pressed into my mind whether I wanted it or not. I stumbled back, gasping. My gloves were slick with condensation from the heat radiating off the object. The air shimmered faintly around it, like asphalt on a summer road, bending the night itself. One of the men shouted at me to get back, his voice tight with panic. Another barked into his radio, desperate to call command, but the device only hissed with distorted noise, every word swallowed by static. The base was barely 2 miles away, and yet it felt as though the forest itself had devoured the signal. That silence, that suffocating stillness, pressed down harder. The craft was so close I could have reached out again, but the truth was undeniable. It didn't belong to this world. Its edges blurred when I stared too long, as if it were caught between being solid and being something else, a presence more than a machine. Beneath it, the ground glowed faintly. Grass and soil had been pressed flat into a perfect circle. No blast marks, no scorch of fuel, no mechanical exhaust. Only heat radiating in slow, steady waves. No sound accompanied it. No hum of engines. The only noise was a ragged rhythm of our own breathing, loud in the vacuum of that unnatural silence. We remained there for what felt like hours, though later the clock revealed only minutes had passed. Time bent in that clearing. Seconds stretched into eternities, and eternities collapsed into seconds. My pulse refused to match the rhythm of reality. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the object began to rise. Not with thrust, not with any visible effort. It simply lifted, as if the laws of gravity were suggestions rather than rules. The glow beneath it brightened, the warmth receded, and in one impossibly smooth motion it drifted upward, sliding between the trees. The three of us craned our necks, eyes wide, as the craft cleared the treetops. Its triangular shape glowed against the stars, then shrank to a point of light, then vanished altogether into the night sky. Only then did the forest exhale. The owls called again. Branches creaked with the wind. Somewhere in the distance, the rustle of a fox moving through the undergrowth reached our ears. The normalcy of the sounds was more unsettling than the silence had been. It was as if the forest had been switched off, paused like a recording, and then unpaused again once the craft departed. With the return of sound came the return of fear. My knees felt weak, my throat raw, and every muscle screamed at me to run. Yet none of us moved. We were rooted to the spot, staring at the circle on the ground as if afraid that turning our backs would invite the thing back again. When we finally staggered out of the trees and made our way back to the base, we must have looked like men returning from a nightmare. Our uniforms clung damp with sweat. Our faces were pale, eyes glassy. The officer on duty looked at us with a mixture of irritation and concern. 3 soldiers stumbling in from the forest with weapons drawn, and radios useless was not routine. We tried to explain, though explain was too generous a word. What poured out of our mouths was fragmented, contradictory. Account of a craft that left no radar trace, markings that seemed to move, silence that pressed like a weight. We must have sounded like madmen. Still, the officer listened long enough to dispatch another team to the site. That second team returned with reports that confirmed part of what we had seen. the indentations in the soil, 3 depressions forming a perfect triangle as though immense weight had rested on 3 invisible legs. Trees near the site bore scorch marks, bark blackened as though exposed to heat far beyond any normal fire. Instruments recorded elevated radiation levels, not enough to be lethal, but far above background. These details would later be written into reports, filed away in folders stamped with words like restricted and classified, folders no one outside the chain of command was ever meant to read. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt exposed. Because the deeper I tried to push the memory away, the more it forced itself back into the forefront of my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those symbols rearranging themselves again. They weren't random. They were deliberate. They wanted to be read. That night was only the beginning. The second team's confirmation spread quickly through whispers, though the official line was tight and sterile. They had seen the indentations in the ground. Yes, they had measured higher than normal radiation. Yes. But when it came to what caused them, the reports turned vague, deliberately neutral. Words like unexplained impressions and anomalous readings replaced what we knew had been there. A craft, a presence, a silence that felt alive. I sat on my bunk that night, unable to sleep. My thoughts circled endlessly. Each time I shut my eyes, the symbols appeared again, glowing faintly behind my eyelids. They twisted and reformed, never holding still long enough for me to decipher. My heart raced, and a dull ache settled in my skull, as if my brain were straining to hold on to something too large for it. The next morning, we were called in for questioning. Not a formal debrief, at least not at first. Just a few officers in a low-lit room, a tape recorder whirring softly on the table. They asked us to recount every detail, every movement, every sound or lack of sound. I tried to keep my answers factual. The time we left the gate, the direction we took, the interference on the radios, the lights, the triangle on the ground. But inevitably, my voice faltered when I reached the part about the symbols. How could I explain that they hadn't just been seen, but felt, that they had carved themselves into me like fire etching stone? The officers exchanged glances, their pens scratching across notepads. One of them leaned forward. "You're saying you saw markings on the craft?" "Yes," I answered, my voice rough. "What kind of markings?" I hesitated. Like symbols, but they changed. They moved. The room fell quiet. The officer looked at me as though he were weighing something, whether I was lying, whether I was sane. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. "Write them down." I picked up the pen, my hand trembling. At first, the page remained blank. But then, almost against my will, the shapes poured out of me. Triangles, arcs, jagged lines intersecting in patterns. They weren't exact. They shifted even as I tried to capture them. When I finished, the paper looked like a mess of geometry. Yet when I pushed it across the table, the officer stared at it with a silence too sharp to ignore. One of them quickly gathered the page, slid it into a folder, and said nothing more. We were dismissed soon after, sent back to routine as though routine could erase what had happened. But I knew from that moment that the story wasn't just ours anymore. It had been taken, swallowed into a machine that would chew it down, grind it into words like lights and anomalies and possible misidentifications. But it wouldn't stay buried, because the next night, the lights came back. Different men saw them this time. Guards on patrol near the perimeter. Men I trusted. Men who didn't scare easy. They described orbs weaving through the trees, beams of light stabbing downward into the ground. Some said they saw the triangular craft again, hovering just beyond reach. Others tried to dismiss it as the beam from the Orfordness lighthouse on the coast. But even as they said it, doubt cracked their voices. A lighthouse beam doesn't weave between trees. It doesn't descend into the forest and vanish without warning. The tension in the barracks thickened. Some men laughed it off, tried to make jokes, but their eyes betrayed them. Others stayed quiet, staring at the floor, unwilling to be dragged into the conversation. On the third night, everything changed. Colonel Charles Halt himself took charge. He wasn't a man who chased fairy tales. He was sharp, disciplined, a career officer who carried authority in every word. When rumors swelled to the point that even senior command couldn't ignore them, Halt decided to lead an investigation. He took a small team into the forest, armed with flashlights, radios, and a tape recorder. That tape still exists. You can hear his voice, steady calm, yet tinged with strain, as he describes the lights darting through the trees, beams shooting down, instruments failing one after another. At one point, his voice rises with disbelief as he says, "There it is again, it's coming this way." Halt wasn't just a frightened recruit. He was a colonel, and he documented it in real time. That should have been the end of doubt, but it wasn't. The official explanation softened everything. The reports released to the public spoke of flares, stars, tricks of the mind, convenient illusions that required no extraordinary answers. The file was closed with words that made the extraordinary sound ordinary. But for those of us who had been there, nothing was ordinary again. The silence of the forest had changed us. After Colonel Halt's expedition, the atmosphere on base shifted in ways that were hard to ignore. Men who had once dismissed the rumors now walked with unease, their conversations clipped and guarded. The tape had circulated quietly among some of us, passed hand to hand like contraband. We listened in silence, the crackle of the recorder filling the barracks as Halt's calm but strained voice narrated what he saw. There was no mistaking it. He had witnessed the same lights, the same beams, the same unearthly patterns in the sky. Hearing a colonel speak aloud what we had seen should have validated us, but instead it deepened the fracture. For if someone of his stature confirmed it, and still the official reports dismissed it, then the truth was not just being ignored, it was being buried. I began noticing small changes in the men who had been out there with me. Ramirez, who had once been outspoken, now avoided eye contact. His laughter disappeared. He moved through his shifts with a quiet, haunted expression, as though he were holding a secret too heavy to bear. Carlson tried to mask his nerves with sarcasm, but his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. And me, I carried the symbols. They haunted me with a persistence that defied logic. By day, they flashed at the edges of my vision, faint but unrelenting. By night, they consumed my dreams. I would wake drenched in sweat, the notebook by my bed already filled with shapes I didn't remember drawing. Triangles intersecting, arcs weaving together, lines repeating in rhythms that felt purposeful. At first, I told myself it was stress, trauma, the mind's way of coping with something too big to process. But deep down, I knew better. These weren't hallucinations. They weren't the ramblings of a mind trying to find order in chaos. They were deliberate. They were teaching me. One night, I returned to the clearing alone. I told no one. I slipped out under the cover of darkness, the winter air sharp in my lungs, frost crunching under my boots. The forest felt different without my fellow airmen, quieter, more intimate, as if it recognized me. When I reached the site, the triangle was still there. The soil bore the same impressions, faint now but undeniable. The trees around the clearing stood blackened at their bases, bark peeled as though kissed by fire. I knelt down, running my glove over the earth. The hum was weaker than before, but still present, a vibration deep in the ground, almost imperceptible, but enough to raise gooseflesh on my arms. And then I saw it. The markings inside the triangle had changed. Where once they had formed one arrangement, now they were different, arcs and jagged lines rearranged into new patterns. My heart hammered in my chest. It wasn't static. It wasn't just a scar. It was alive, shifting, rewriting itself over time. The realization chilled me to core. The encounter hadn't ended when the craft left. It was ongoing. I crouched closer, my breath fogging the cold air, and for a moment I thought I heard something, faint static, like whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. My radio hissed at my hip, though I hadn't touched it. The same interference as before, but pulsing now, rhythmic, as if coded. I froze, unsure if I was losing my mind or if the forest itself was trying to speak. When I finally pulled myself away and returned to base, I didn't tell anyone. Who would believe that the ground itself was alive, that the soil still spoke weeks after the lights had vanished? Even I barely believed it. But the dreams confirmed it. Night after night, the symbols returned, growing more complex, more insistent. Sometimes they floated in darkness, glowing with their own light. Other times they unfolded into vast structures, grids, maps, architectures I couldn't comprehend. I woke with my chest heaving, my head aching, my hands stained with ink from frantic scribbles. Ramirez noticed one morning as I stuffed a notebook under my pillow. "You're still drawing them," he said flatly. I froze. He shook his head. "You need to stop. They'll think you're crazy. Worse, they'll think you're compromised." His voice dropped to a whisper. "And if command thinks that—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. We all knew what happened to men deemed liabilities. But how could I stop? It wasn't a choice. The symbols poured out of me the way sweat pours from skin, the way breath escapes lungs. They weren't mine, but they lived in me now. And I began to fear that whatever intelligence had touched me in that clearing hadn't just shown itself. It had left something behind. The weeks that followed blurred together, yet each day carried its own weight. Outwardly, life on base returned to its routines, briefings, patrols, drills that echoed the monotony of the Cold War. But beneath that surface, a quiet fracture widened. Men spoke less, their eyes betraying what their words refused to. Every patrol into the forest carried a tension that never eased, as if the trees themselves might shift and reveal something watching from the dark. For me, the fracture ran deeper. I could no longer separate waking life from the symbols that invaded my mind. During shifts, I found myself tracing lines on scraps of paper, repeating patterns that felt familiar, without ever becoming clear. The notebook by my bunk grew thicker, filled with pages of triangles, arcs, spirals, an endless cascade of geometry. The strangest part wasn't that I drew them. It was that they made sense. Not in a way I could articulate, but in a way I felt. Each line seemed to connect to another, like chords in music, resonating with an order I couldn't explain but recognized instinctively. I told no one. Not Carlson, not Ramirez, not even the officers who probed us for updates with their thin smiles and colder eyes. I knew the moment I admitted the symbols were still with me, I would no longer be seen as reliable. I would be marked as unstable, maybe even dangerous. And in the military, once you carried that mark, your life was no longer your own. But secrecy carried its own weight. The more I bottled it up, the more the symbols consumed me. I woke in the night with my chest heaving, the hum of the forest vibrating in my bones, as though I were still there, still kneeling in that clearing with the craft hovering above me. My dreams felt less like imagination and more like transmission, less like sleep and more like reception. Rumors of outsiders arriving only deepened the unease. Men in plain clothes were seen on base, carrying briefcases, moving with quiet authority. They didn't wear uniforms, didn't salute, and yet even senior officers deferred to them. Some said they were intelligence agents. Others whispered men in black, with nervous chuckles that weren't jokes at all. Whoever they were, they asked questions. Questions about lights, about soil samples, about the reliability of witnesses. Questions that stripped experiences down to data points, leaving the weight of the truth behind. I began to notice that files disappeared. Reports that had been logged one day were gone the next. Carlson mentioned casually that the folder containing our statements was missing from the records room. When he asked about it, he was told he must have misfiled it. Carlson didn't argue, but his face told another story. The silence grew louder. It wasn't just about what we had seen. It was about what we weren't allowed to acknowledge we had seen. The truth wasn't denied outright. It was diluted, reframed, reclassified until it was something unrecognizable. And in that dilution, the burden shifted onto us, the witnesses. We were left to carry the raw memory, while the official record carried only shadows. Ramirez finally cracked. One evening, sitting on his bunk with his head in his hands, he muttered, "It didn't happen. We didn't see it. That's what I'm telling myself. That's what I have to tell myself." His voice shook, and I knew he didn't believe his own words. But denial was the only shield he had left. Carlson took another path. He grew cynical, bitter, muttering that we were pawns in a game we'd never understand. "They'll bury this," he told me one night, his eyes hard. "They'll bury us too, if we push too hard. Best thing we could do is shut up and move on." But I couldn't move on, because the symbols wouldn't let me. One night, I woke with such clarity it frightened me. I had been dreaming again, patterns unfolding, symbols rearranging, And when I opened my eyes, I understood them differently. Not as words, not as pictures, but as instructions. I grabbed my notebook and sketched feverishly, my hand moving faster than thought. By the time dawn broke, I had filled 10 pages. Looking at them afterward, I didn't know what they meant, but I knew they meant something. And that was when the fear shifted. It was no longer fear of the craft, or the forest, or even of the silence. It was fear of myself. Fear that whatever intelligence had touched me had not just shown me something, but had planted something inside me. An echo, a seed, a fragment of itself. Sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the mirror, I didn't fully recognize the man staring back. My eyes looked the same, yet behind them, something moved, something patient, something waiting, and that terrified me more than the forest ever had. The silence that followed was the heaviest of all. Not the silence of the forest on that first night, but the silence imposed on us afterward, an institutional silence, colder than anything nature could produce. It pressed down in meetings and briefings, in the casual way superiors looked through us as though daring us to speak too much. Officially, the Rendlesham incident ended with reports stamped and filed under headings no one outside command was meant to see. Unofficially, it never ended at all. Not for me, not for Carlson, not even for Ramirez, though he tried hardest of all to bury it. The weeks turned into months. On the surface, life at Woodbridge returned to its Cold War rhythm. Drills against threats that might never come, readiness checks for bombers we hoped would never launch. But something in us had shifted permanently. Every flash of light on the horizon set our nerves on edge. Every burst of static on the radio made our throats tighten. We lived in constant readiness not just for Soviet threats, but for the return of something we could neither fight nor understand. I kept drawing. I couldn't stop. The notebook filled with page after page of symbols, each night birthing new patterns, each dream forcing my hand to capture what my waking mind couldn't explain. Sometimes I stared at them for hours, convinced they were on the brink of revealing themselves, only to be left with a gnawing hunger when they refused to resolve. Other times, I swore I understood, just for an instant, only to have the understanding vanish like mist at sunrise. Carlson eventually asked to see them. I hesitated, then handed him the notebook. He flipped through silently, his face pale, his lips pressed in. Finally, he looked at me with an expression that was neither fear nor curiosity, but pity. "You can't let anyone else see this," he whispered. "They'll lock you away." I nodded, but inside I felt something worse than fear, agreement, because by then I had begun to realize the symbols weren't fading with time. They were growing stronger, more insistent, and that meant they weren't just memories. They were ongoing, a connection, a tether that stretched from that clearing into me, binding me to something I had never invited. The years passed. I left the service, built a life outside the fences and floodlights of the base. Yet the forest followed me. The hum never left my chest. The dreams came less often, but when they did, they were clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore. One night, long after I left the Air Force, I woke with the certainty that the symbols had finally arranged themselves into something complete. I stumbled to my desk, switched on the lamp, and began to draw. Hours passed without my noticing. When dawn came, the page before me was filled with a vast pattern, intricate and symmetrical, unlike anything I had ever drawn before. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. I didn't understand it. Not really. But deep in my bones, I knew it wasn't nonsense. It was a message, and that is what haunts me most. Because if it was a message, it wasn't meant for me alone. I sometimes wonder why we were chosen. Why 3 men on a cold December night were brought face to face with the impossible. Was it chance? A mistake? Or was it deliberate? A selection made for reasons beyond our comprehension? I wonder, too, what would have happened if I had stepped closer that first night, if my hand had touched the surface of the craft. Would I have vanished? Would I have been taken? Or would I have understood everything in a single instant and lost myself in the process? These are the questions that linger decades later, when the world insists on forgetting Rendlesham as a footnote, a curiosity, a case of mistaken identity. But I know better. I was there. I saw it. I felt it. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and my house is still, I feel it again. That hum, that presence, that sense that the forest never truly let me go. Perhaps one day the truth will surface. Perhaps the notebooks filled with symbols will find their meaning in the hands of someone who can unlock them. Or perhaps they will remain forever what they are now, a record of an encounter that refuses to die, etched not in soil or bark, but in the mind of man who cannot forget. And so I leave you with this question, the one I can no longer silence. If knowledge you cannot understand is given to you, does it belong to you? Or are you merely carrying it for someone or something else? I don't know the answer. I only know that on a winter's night in 1980, in Rendlesham Forest, something impossible touched me, and I have never been the same. I wish I could tell you that life returned to normal after those nights in the forest, that we filed our reports, closed the case, and went back to the monotony of drills, paperwork, and Cold War watchfulness. I wish I could tell you that the Rendlesham incident was just another entry in the logs of military history, a curiosity noted, filed, and forgotten. But it didn't happen that way. The truth of Rendlesham did not end with the lights in the sky. If anything, those lights were only the beginning. When we came back to the base after the second night, something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just among us, the men who had seen it firsthand. It was everywhere. Orders were issued faster, but with fewer explanations. Conversations became clipped careful, like every word was weighed before being spoken. The usual camaraderie between men, the joking and teasing that made the endless nights bearable, faded into silence. Everyone felt it, even those who hadn't set foot in the woods. There was tension you could taste. It clung to the walls of the barracks, hummed in the hallways, sat heavy in the mess hall. And the strangest thing was that no one needed to name it. We all knew something had happened. Something too big to ignore, too strange to explain. That was when the men in plain clothes started arriving at Woodbridge. They weren't part of our unit. And they didn't carry themselves like soldiers. They didn't salute. They didn't march. They walked with an authority that came from something other than rank. Their suits were pressed, their expressions cold and unreadable. They moved through the base like they owned it, and everyone, officers included, stepped aside. They didn't introduce themselves. They didn't need to. We knew what they were, intelligence. And intelligence never came unless something mattered. I remember the first time I saw them step out of a black car parked near the command offices. They carried briefcases and clipboards, and even from a distance I could see that their eyes scanned everything. Not curious, not searching, but confirming, as if they already knew what happened, and we're here to check whether our version matched theirs. They disappeared into rooms we didn't have clearance to enter. Files were collected. Logs were copied. Conversations that had once taken place in the open now happened behind closed doors. And those of us who had been on patrol were called in one by one for questioning. When it was my turn, I walked into a dimly lit room that smelled faintly of coffee and stale cigarette smoke. At the table sat two men in suits and one officer I didn't recognize. A tape recorder sat in the center, its reels already spinning. They gestured for me to sit. The questions came fast, sharp, precise. Not the usual kind where they wanted a detailed account to piece together a story. These men already had a story. What they wanted was to measure me against it. What time did you leave the base? How far into the forest did you go? What was the shape of the object? Describe the lights. Their tone was clinical, detached, as though I were just another instrument to be tested. When they asked about the markings, my hand tightened on the edge of the table. For a moment I considered lying, downplaying it, but the memory was too strong. I told them what I saw. The symbols etched along the surface, the way they glowed, the way they shifted like living script. One of the men leaned forward then, his eyes fixed on me. His stare was so intense it made my throat dry. He asked me to describe them again, then again, until I was repeating the same lines and arcs so many times I began to feel dizzy. When I faltered, he slid a pad of paper across the table. "Draw them," he said. I picked up the pen, my hand trembling. Slowly, shapes emerged on the page. Triangles within triangles, lines intersecting, Strange arcs bending in patterns I didn't understand. The more I drew, the more the images seemed to come on their own, as if my hand remembered what my conscious mind did not. When I finished, the man didn't look surprised. He didn't even ask what the symbols meant. He simply slid the page into a folder and nodded to the officer beside him. The rest of the questions blurred together. What direction did the craft move? How long did it hover? Did I hear anything? Smell anything? Feel anything unusual? By the time they dismissed me, my head was pounding and my chest felt hollow. Before I left, one of the men in suit spoke for first and only time. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but his words carried the weight of a hammer. Remember your duty. This is not a matter for speculation or gossip. National security depends on silence. It wasn't phrased as a suggestion. It was an order. I signed papers I wasn't allowed to read in full. I placed my initials where they pointed, my signature where they instructed. By the time I left that room, I was officially bound to silence. But no piece of paper can erase what the mind remembers. That night, when I finally laid down on my bunk, I thought exhaustion would claim me. Instead, the nightmares began. I was back in the forest. Alone this time. The clearing stretched out before me, the air thick, the silence suffocating. The craft hovered just above the ground, its lights pulsing, its presence pressing against me like a storm cloud. The symbols blazed brighter than before, searing themselves into me. Each time I tried to look away, they pulled me back, a magnet dragging the mind. I woke drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my hands shaking. But even in the fluorescent light of the barracks, the symbols lingered at the edges of my vision. They weren't just dreams. They were intrusions, fragments forced into me that I could never scrub out. And I wasn't the only one. I wasn't the only one. In the mess hall, in the barracks, even during drills, I began to notice the subtle cracks in the men who had been out there with me. A few kept their silence perfectly, burying it so deeply you'd never know anything unusual had happened. But others, they carried it in their eyes, in the slump of their shoulders, in the sudden temper that flared when someone asked an innocent question. Carlson, who had always been the calmest among us, now snapped at trivial mistakes. Ramirez, once the loudest, the one who filled long shifts with jokes and stories, hardly spoke at all. And at night, I sometimes heard muffled sounds from bunks across the room. Men thrashing their sheets, muttering, sometimes gasping awake with a sharp cry they tried to pass off as a cough. No one talked about it openly. Not really. But in whispers, in brief stolen conversations, pieces slipped out. You see it when you close your eyes? One man asked me in a hushed tone, his fork untouched on the tray before him. Like it's still there? Another admitted he hadn't slept more than an hour a night since that second patrol. Every time I drift off, I hear it, he said. Like a hum. Like it's still out there, waiting. The thing was, I knew exactly what they meant. The hum wasn't just in the forest anymore. It was in us. For me, it grew worse. Every dream pulled me back to the clearing. Every dream replayed the encounter, only this time, details shifted. Sometimes the symbols arranged themselves into new patterns. Sometimes the craft wasn't hovering. It was descending closer and closer until I thought it would swallow me whole. And sometimes I wasn't standing there as myself at all. I was watching from inside the craft, looking out through the pulsing glow at my own trembling figure in uniform. I woke shaking, drenched in sweat, heart pounding as though I had run miles. The others tried to bury their fear. I couldn't, because the symbols wouldn't let me. During the day, I found myself sketching them without meaning to, on scraps of paper, on the margins of duty logs, even once on the back of my own hand before realizing what I was doing. It was as if my body remembered them even when my mind tried not to. It didn't take long before others noticed. One evening, Carlson caught sight of the notebook I'd been filling in secret. His eyes widened when he saw the pages. Rows and rows of shapes, arcs, sequences repeating like mantras. He flipped through silently, his face pale. Then he closed it firmly and shoved it back into my chest. "Don't let anyone else see this," he muttered. "Not the officers. Not those men in suits. Nobody. You hear me?" "Why?" I asked, though the answer was already clear. "Because they'll take it," he said. His voice was low, urgent. "And they'll take you with it. You'll disappear into some hole, and we'll never hear from you again." I didn't argue. I simply tucked the notebook back under my bunk, but my hands trembled as I did. It was then I began to understand the true weight of what had happened in Rendlesham. The craft was terrifying, yes. The lights, the silence, the symbols, they had shaken me to my core. But the greater fear wasn't the unknown in the forest. It was the known inside the base. The way command moved so quickly to tighten control. The way information was being stripped, sanitized, and erased. Whispers spread that men in plain clothes had begun interviewing others, not just those of us who had been there, but anyone who had even heard about it secondhand. Files were taken, duty logs rewritten, and when someone asked too many questions, they were reassigned, sometimes quietly without warning. It wasn't paranoia. It was happening. And the strangest part was that the more they tried to silence it, the more the truth leaked. Small pieces appeared in local papers. Stories of strange lights near the base, of UFOs spotted by farmers, of rumors whispered by civilians who had seen our patrols in the woods. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Just gossip. Just the imagination of a community that lived too close to a military installation. But then came the headlines. UFOs over Suffolk? American base linked to mysterious lights. We were warned again, this time more sharply. If asked, deny everything. If pressed, stick to the official explanation. Stars, flares, the lighthouse beam. But even as they said the words, their eyes betrayed them. They knew it wasn't stars. They knew it wasn't flares. And they knew the lighthouse couldn't explain symbols that burned into minds of soldiers. As weeks turned into months, the silence around Rendlesham only deepened. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from forgetting, but the kind that is enforced, layered carefully, deliberately, until it becomes as suffocating as the forest itself had been. The orders were clear: deny, dismiss, deflect. If questioned by journalists, respond with a half-smile and a shake of the head. If pressed by civilians, mention the lighthouse, the weather, or even suggest fatigue had played tricks on the eyes. But what we were never allowed to do was speak plainly about what we had seen. Yet the truth didn't disappear. It seeped through cracks. Someone leaked just enough for whispers to grow. Local papers picked up rumors of UFOs in the Suffolk skies, and soon foreign journalists began sniffing around. Before long, the phrase British Roswell appeared in print. Some mocked it, treating it as another campfire story. Others reported it with a tone of intrigue. But no matter how it was presented, one thing was clear. The story was out. Inside the base, tension grew unbearable. Every man felt watched. His words weighed. Rumors swirled that phones were tapped, letters intercepted, and movements quietly tracked. And maybe it was paranoia, but paranoia in an environment like Woodbridge during the Cold War was entirely unfounded. We were already living in a world of surveillance. The difference now was that the surveillance felt personal. I found myself pulling further inward. The notebook of symbols grew thicker, the lines sharper, the patterns stranger. At times I'd wake in the middle of the night with a pen already in my hand, scribbling furiously, not even fully aware I was awake. Some mornings I'd flip through the pages and feel chilled, not because of what I had drawn, but because the handwriting didn't quite feel like mine. It was around this time that Sergeant Jim Peniston's story began to surface among us. He had been one of the first to approach the craft, one of the few who had actually laid his hand on its surface. He confided, carefully and only to a trusted few, that when he touched it, the symbols had burned into him, just as they had into me. But for him, something else had happened. When he returned to his quarters that night, he began filling his own notebook, not with sketches, but with binary code, long strings of ones and zeros that he couldn't explain. At first, he thought it was nonsense, a compulsion he couldn't resist. But later, those codes would be analyzed and claimed to translate into coordinates across the globe, places of ancient mystery, of spiritual and historical significance. Whether coincidence or not, the fact that such information came from a man who swore he had no background in mathematics or cryptography only deepened the enigma. Hearing his story made my own burden heavier. If Peniston had been touched in the same way, then this wasn't just personal madness. It wasn't just me losing my grip. Something had been given to us, or forced onto us. A message, a fragment, a burden. Meanwhile, the media storm grew. American outlets began running segments, some mocking, some serious. Television anchors spoke of strange lights, tape recordings, and witnesses who refused to go on record. Late-night radio turned it into a staple, callers swearing they had seen the same lights across the world. And the more it spread, the more command at Woodbridge clamped down. Files vanished. Reports were edited. Those who spoke too much found themselves reassigned to other bases, sometimes overseas, sometimes without explanation. A few men simply left the service altogether, their careers abandoned, their reputations stained by whispers of instability. I envied them at times. At least they were free to walk away. For me, freedom didn't exist, not with the symbols still burning in my mind. The truth is, I didn't want to walk away. As much as I feared it, part of me needed to understand it. Each time the glyphs returned in my dreams, each time I filled another page in my notebook, I felt a pull, like a puzzle demanding to be solved, a question that would never let me rest until I answered it. And yet, the more I leaned into that need, the more I realized how dangerous it was. Because the further I went, the more I risked becoming someone I didn't recognize. By the time spring arrived, months after those December nights, the Rendlesham incident had already become two very different stories. There was the official one, clean and forgettable, trimmed into something that could be dismissed with a shrug. And then there was the one we carried, the one etched into memory, the one no amount of silence could erase. The contrast between those two stories was maddening. I remember walking into a briefing where an officer calmly explained to us how the local press had gotten it wrong, how the lights we'd seen were most likely the Orfordness lighthouse beam, refracted through the mist. He said it like it was fact, like we hadn't been standing only yards away from a craft that bent silence itself. Around the room, a few men nodded dutifully. Most sat in stony silence, their jaws tight, their eyes refusing to meet. That was the moment I realized the truth wasn't just being hidden from the public. It was being hidden from us too. We were being asked to forget what we had lived, to trade the reality of our own eyes for the comfort of someone else's narrative. Some tried. Ramirez, especially. He stopped talking about it altogether, shutting himself off from even Carlson and me. When I pressed him once, asking if he still dreamed, his eyes filled with something between fear and fury. "Don't," he snapped. "Don't make me say it." That was the last time I asked. Carlson coped differently. He buried himself in routine, volunteering for extra duties, doubling down on drills, anything to exhaust his body enough to keep the dreams at bay. But I could see the cracks. When the lights flickered during a power outage one evening, he froze in place, his breathing shallow, until I shook him out of it. And me? I had long since given up pretending I could escape it. The notebook grew heavier by the day, its pages filled with symbols that no one else dared look at. I sometimes caught myself staring at them for hours, tracing the lines with my fingers, convinced that meaning hovered just beyond my grasp. It wasn't just compulsion anymore, it was obsession. That was when the outsiders returned. The same plainclothes men who had interrogated us in those first days began reappearing around the base. They didn't hold meetings this time. They didn't ask questions. They simply collected files, logs, personal effects. Once, I even saw one of them slip a manila envelope from an officer's desk into his briefcase, without so much as a glance around the room. It was clear by then that the Rendlesham case wasn't being closed. It was being transferred, taken out of our hands, out of the Air Force's hands, and given to something or someone else. The paranoia deepened. Whispers of tapped phones became whispers of men being followed into town. Some even claimed they saw unmarked cars parked outside their homes on leave. At first I dismissed it as stress. But then one night, walking back in the barracks, I noticed a dark sedan idling near the perimeter road, its headlights off. As I approached, the engine roared to life and it sped away without a word. That was when I stopped dismissing anything. The pressure inside me grew unbearable. The symbols no longer came only in dreams. They bled into waking life. I saw them when I blinked against sunlight, when I stared too long at the green glow of radar screens, even in the random cracks on a concrete wall. My brain was rewriting the world in their shapes. One night, I caught Carlson watching me as I scribbled furiously by lamplight. His face was pale. "It's eating you alive," he said quietly. I wanted to argue, to tell him I was fine, but I wasn't, and we both knew it, because the real battle wasn't in the forest anymore. It wasn't even with the suits who tried to bury the truth. It was inside us, inside me. Every page I feel brought me closer to something I couldn't name. A truth, maybe, or a breaking point. And I began to wonder if that was the point all along. Years passed, but Rendlesham never left me. It followed me like a shadow, stitched into every dream, every flicker of silence too deep to be natural. For a long time, I tried to pretend. I married. I worked. I told myself the forest was behind me, but the symbols never left. They lived in me. At first, I resisted. I stopped keeping the notebooks, forced myself to ignore the pull to draw, but it didn't matter. They came anyway, etched behind my eyelids when I closed my eyes, burned into the static of a television when the signal slipped, hidden in the patterns of leaves when the wind blew through the trees. No matter where I looked, the world found ways to remind me, and then came the dreams. In them, I stood once again in the clearing. The craft hovered silently, closer than before, its lights pulsing like the rhythm of a heart. But now there was no fear, only inevitability. The symbols burned brighter, rearranging themselves, growing more complex until they formed vast structures, maps, circuits, constellations. I would wake with tears in my eyes, convinced I had glimpsed something larger than humanity itself. But the cruelest part was that the understanding always slipped away with the dawn. Over time, I began to accept that the craft had not just visited Rendlesham. It had left something behind, a fragment of itself, seeded into us, into me, whether it was a message, a warning, or something else entirely. I still don't know, but I carried it. I still do. The world outside never understood. To most, Rendlesham became nothing more than a curiosity, a British Roswell mentioned in passing by television specials and tabloid headlines. Some believed, most laughed, and for those of us who had stood in that forest, the ridicule cut deeper than the silence, because we knew what we had seen, what we had felt, and no amount of dismissive reports could erase the truth that had burned into us like fire etched into stone. I often think of Peniston, of the notebook he filled with binary code, of how years later, researchers claimed it translated into coordinates of ancient sites across the world. I think of Carlson, who carried the memory quietly, letting it corrode him in silence until he left the service altogether. I think of Ramirez, who buried it so deeply he pretended it never happened, only for the truth to haunt him anyway. And I think of myself, sitting here decades later, pen in hand, still drawing the same impossible symbols, knowing they will outlive me. Sometimes I wonder if that was the intention all along, that the craft wasn't just showing itself to us. It was planting seeds that would grow in silence, across years and continents, until one day they would bloom into something we can't yet comprehend. I can't prove it. I can't even explain it. All I can do is bear witness. And so I ask you now, whoever you are listening to these words, if knowledge you cannot understand is placed in your hands, do you treat it as a burden, or do you treat it as a gift? Because Rendlesham gave me both, and it never let me go. In the months that followed Rendlesham, the silence inside the base became heavier than the silence of the forest. That night in Suffolk had been suffocating, but at least it had been the silence of nature, an unnatural stillness, yes, but one that ended when the craft rose and vanished. The silence afterward, however, was different. It was human. It was deliberate, and in many ways, it was far more dangerous. Orders came down quickly and without room for interpretation. Deny, deflect, dismiss. There would be no acknowledgement, no discussion, no validation of what we had seen. Officially, the events were reduced to lights in the sky, perhaps flares, perhaps the Orfordness lighthouse. Unofficially, the burden of memory was ours to carry alone. Yet outside the guarded gates, the story had already begun to take on a life of its own. It slipped into local newspapers, first as rumor, then as front-page curiosity. It found its way into late-night radio broadcasts, where callers with trembling voices described lights they had seen across the world. It spread into the whispers of UFO researchers, men and women who treated testimonies like puzzle pieces scattered across decades and continents. They pinned them on walls, drew lines between them, hunted for patterns that never seemed to fit cleanly together. And before long, Rendlesham was no longer just a strange incident in Suffolk. It was part of something bigger. I remember the first time I realized this. Months later, while on leave, I picked up a small American newspaper in a London cafe. The headline was playful, almost mocking. Little green men in an English forest? The article summarized what the public knew. Strange lights, confused patrols, and an official statement pointing to flares or misinterpretation. But buried at the very end, almost as an afterthought, was a single line that froze me where I sat. Sources suggest similarities to unexplained sightings reported by U.S. military personnel in the past. It was the first time I understood that we were not alone, not just in the sense of what we had seen in the forest, but in the sense of being witnesses. Others before us had stood in uniform, sworn to secrecy, and stared at something impossible. Their stories had been buried, their reputations questioned, their experiences dismissed. And now ours was joining theirs, part of a lineage of silence. The comparison spread quickly. Within weeks, I saw Roswell resurface in headlines. Old rumors about Wright-Patterson Air Force Base returned. Stories of hangars that never opened to public, of recovered craft hidden in warehouses under armed guard. In grainy television interviews, former pilots hinted at things they had seen in the skies over Korea, over Vietnam, things they swore no other balloon or experimental jet could explain. The pattern was impossible to ignore. For every denial issued by officials, 2 new claims surfaced from men who had served, fought, and bled for their countries. The more they denied, the more the whispers grew. Inside our unit, this growing noise outside made things harder. Some of us felt a strange vindication. Finally, it seemed, the world was beginning to ask the questions we were forbidden to answer. Others grew nervous, convinced that the more attention Rendlesham attracted, the closer the scrutiny would come to us, the ones who had seen it up close. I saw men who once carried themselves with confidence begin to shrink into the background, avoiding conversations, avoiding eye contact, as though staying invisible might protect them. What none of us could ignore, however, was that the story was no longer ours to control. Civilian ufologists began arriving in Suffolk, drawn like moths to a flame. They interviewed locals who had seen lights. They combed the forest with Geiger counters. They photographed the scorched trees and measured the triangular impressions in the soil. Some were amateurs chasing fantasies, the kind of people we were trained to laugh at. But others carried real instruments, took real notes, spoke with discipline and patience. For the first time, I wondered if the truth might survive despite the silence imposed on us. At the same time, the intelligence presence at Woodbridge did not fade. If anything, it grew sharper. Files vanished. Briefings took on a new edge. We were told again and again about the danger of disinformation, the importance of loyalty, the need for absolute silence. And I began to suspect that the most important goal was not convincing the public that nothing had happened. It was convincing us. If they could make us doubt our own eyes, our own memories, then the truth would die with us. But I could not forget. Every time I tried, the memory of that triangular craft came roaring back. The oppressive silence, the heat radiating from its surface, the symbols that had etched themselves into my mind. These were not tricks of light, not flares or lighthouses. I knew that with every fiber of my being. And I was not alone. Peniston still scribbled in his notebooks. Page after page of binary sequences that seemed to pour out of him like water from a cracked pipe. He admitted he didn't understand them, but he couldn't stop. Burroughs, another man who had been with us in the forest, complained of headaches, of bursts of energy that knocked him to his knees, of medical conditions no doctor could explain. The encounter had not ended in the forest. It had followed us home. It had followed us into our bodies, into our dreams, into our silence. The public's curiosity grew with every passing week. What began as small articles buried in local papers soon spread across the Atlantic. American outlets picked it up, and suddenly Rendlesham was no longer just an odd British tale. It was international. Talk shows joked about flying saucers in the Queen's backyard. Radio hosts opened their lines to callers who claimed to have seen strange lights in their own towns. And beneath the laughter, something serious stirred. For every skeptic, there were two voices trembling with conviction. Farmers who described glowing orbs above their fields. Fishermen who swore they saw lights vanish into the sea. Truck drivers who told of crafts pacing along dark highways. It became harder to dismiss. And then the comparisons began in earnest. Roswell reappeared on television. Old black and white footage of desert debris. Grainy photos of supposed wreckage. Interviews with locals who spoke of soldiers arriving overnight to sweep everything away. Wright-Patterson was mentioned again, whispered as the resting place of technologies not meant for human hands. I remember one night in the barracks, Carlson sliding a folded newspaper across the table toward me. The headline read, U.S. pilots break silence on UFO encounters. The article quoted men who had flown in Vietnam, describing lights that dance around their jets, outpacing them effortlessly before vanishing into thin air. One pilot, his name withheld, said plainly, "We knew it wasn't ours, and it wasn't theirs either." We read the article in silence. No one laughed. No one cracked a joke, because we knew exactly what he meant. But the more the outside world whispered, the heavier the silence became inside the base. Briefings grew sharper. Commanders emphasized discipline like never before. Loose talk is dangerous. They warned us. Rumors compromise security. Every word felt like a blade pressed against our throats. We didn't need to be reminded what could happen to men who ignored such warnings. Careers ended quietly. Transfers appeared overnight. Reputations unraveled without explanation. And the men in plain clothes never left. They appeared less often in daylight, but you felt them everywhere. In the mess hall, in the motor pool, in the way officers fell silent mid-sentence when a door opened. Files that had been logged one day were missing the next. Men who had been too curious were suddenly reassigned to other posts, their bunks empty without so much as a farewell. It was clear Rendlesham was not just a story. It was an operation. For me, the pressure only deepened the obsession. The symbols refused to let me go. At times they felt like a sickness, a fever that returned each night. I saw them in dreams, glowing against the dark. I saw them in daylight, burned into the afterimage when I blinked. My notebook filled faster than I could keep track. Sometimes I stared at those pages until my head throbbed, convinced the patterns were on the edge of revealing themselves. Other times, I feared the opposite, that they weren't messages at all, but tools. That by drawing them, by giving them form, I was playing a role I didn't understand in something I couldn't control. Burroughs struggled in his own way. His health deteriorated. He complained of flashes of light in his vision, bursts of static in his ears, pressure in his chest. The medics dismissed it as stress, but I saw the fear in his eyes. He wasn't faking. Something had followed him home. Peniston, too, carried his burden. We spoke once, briefly, in a hushed corner of the barracks. He admitted he didn't understand the binary that poured from his hand, but he couldn't stop writing it. "It's like I'm remembering something I was never taught," he whispered. His voice shook, like it's being downloaded. We stood in silence. Two men united not by answers, but by questions too heavy to speak aloud. Outside, the press called it the British Roswell. Inside, it felt like a cage. And in that cage, we were left to wonder which was more terrifying, that we had seen something not of this world, or that those in power already knew and had built an entire system to keep it buried. By the summer of 1981, the Rendlesham incident had become something larger than any of us could have imagined. It was no longer a local curiosity. It had grown into a story woven into a tapestry of whispers stretching across decades. And with every month that passed, I realized how little control we had over it. Civilian investigators began showing up around Suffolk in greater numbers. Some carried cameras and tape recorders, others Geiger counters and compasses. They mapped the forest, measured the trees, traced the triangular indentations in the soil. A few even approached the gates of the base, pressing questions on the guards who stood stone-faced and silent. Some of us laughed them off, men with strange haircuts and briefcases full of UFO magazines. But others weren't so easy to dismiss. They kept detailed records, compared witness accounts, cross-referenced sightings from across the world. And when they spoke to locals who had seen lights that same December, their findings began to echo our own memories too closely for comfort. One evening, I overheard two officers muttering in the mess hall about a journalist who had been digging too deeply. "He's connecting dots that shouldn't be connected," one said. "If he publishes, it'll stir things up in Washington." The other only shook his head and muttered, "It won't get that far." I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to. By then, the comparisons to Roswell had become unavoidable. American media resurrected the desert crash from 1947, running montages of headlines, photos, and grainy interviews with aging witnesses. Wright-Patterson was mentioned again and again. Hangar 18 whispered, as if it were myth, yet spoken with the weight of truth. The message was clear. Rendlesham was not the first, and it would not be the last. Within our unit, this outside noise gnawed at us differently. Ramirez grew visibly nervous, avoiding any mention of the event, burying himself in routine until he became a shadow of the man he once was. Carlson leaned the other way, reading every article he could get his hands on, hungry for validation, desperate for proof that we weren't insane. And me. I teetered somewhere in between, torn between the need for silence and the hunger for answers. But silence remained the order of the day. The men in plain clothes never truly left. They hovered at the edges, appearing when least expected. Sometimes I would spot one walking with a senior officer, briefcase in hand, speaking in tones too low to catch. Other times I saw them observing from a distance, their gazes sweeping over us like we were specimens instead of soldiers. Their presence became so constant, it was like the base itself had grown new shadows. One night, I returned to my bunk to find my notebook missing. Panic seized me. Dozens of pages filled with the symbols I couldn't stop drawing. Gone. My chest tightened as I tore apart my locker, my footlocker, every corner of my space. Hours later, the notebook reappeared on my pillow. Nothing else was disturbed. No explanation. But when I flipped through it, I swore the pages weren't exactly as I'd left them. Some of the sketches looked sharper, darker, as if someone had traced them. From that night forward, I no longer believed the notebook was mine alone. The paranoia spread. Burroughs confided that he felt followed whenever he left the base on leave. Peniston said his notebook had gone missing once, only to return weeks later in the same strange condition as mine. Carlson admitted that he had woken in the barracks more than once to find a man in a suit watching him, saying nothing, vanishing before he could speak. We all wondered if it was real, or if the weight of Rendlesham was breaking us apart from the inside. And yet, the outside world kept asking the same questions we could not. Why did so many stories match? Why did lights dance across the skies of England, New Mexico, Vietnam, and the open seas? Why did pilots, soldiers, and sailors all describe the same silence, the same impossible speed, the same sense of being watched? I knew the answer I carried inside me, though I never spoke it aloud. It wasn't coincidence. It was a pattern. And patterns don't exist without design. What haunted me most wasn't the possibility that the truth was extraterrestrial. What haunted me was a possibility that those in power already knew, and that the real secret wasn't the craft, but the lengths they would go to bury it. And in my darkest moments, I wondered if we, the witnesses, weren't just unlucky soldiers who stumbled upon the unknown. I wondered if we had been chosen. By the autumn that followed, I realized that Rendlesham wasn't just an incident. It had become a dividing line in my life. There was before the forest, and there was after, nothing in between. Before, I had been a soldier like any other, trained to follow orders, drilled into discipline, grounded in the belief that the world, no matter how dangerous, still followed rules. After, I understood that rules were fragile, that truth could be erased with the stroke of a pen, and that silence could be enforced more effectively than chains. The media circus continued outside the gates. More journalists arrived in Suffolk, some local, some foreign. They spoke to villagers, to farmers, to anyone who might have seen the lights that December. Civilians brought forth photographs of scorched trees, plaster casts of indentations in the soil, tape recordings of interviews with guards who spoke anonymously. Each fragment was incomplete, but together they formed a picture too familiar to ignore. And yet inside the base we were told again and again, it didn't happen. Forget it. But forgetting was impossible. Ramirez had grown so withdrawn he barely spoke. His once booming laugh, the kind that carried through barracks, was gone. Some nights I heard him mumbling in his sleep. Words I couldn't make out, as though he were speaking to someone only he could see. By day, he avoided our eyes, staring past us like a man already half removed from the world around him. Carlson, on the other hand, was restless. He collected clippings, hidden beneath his mattress, articles from British and American papers. Sometimes I caught him late at night, reading them by flashlight, scribbling notes in the margins. He was chasing proof, as a validation from the outside world might ease the weight he carried inside. As for me, the symbols never let go. My notebook filled faster than I could control. Sometimes I woke to find new pages covered in markings I had no memory of drawing. Arcs, triangles, repeating sequences. They weren't random. They had rhythm, structure, purpose. At times I thought they might be maps. At other times, I feared they were instructions. Once, while staring at a completed page, I felt something shift in my mind, like a lock turning, like the edge of comprehension brushing against me. My pulse quickened, and I thought for a moment I might finally understand. But just as quickly, it was gone, leaving only emptiness and a deeper hunger. That hunger frightened me, because the more I surrendered to it, the less I recognized myself. The intelligence presence never faded. Men in plain suits came and went, their briefcases heavier each time. Once, while walking into command offices, I glimpsed a stack of files on a desk, stamped in red, classified Rendlesham. The next day, the files were gone. The sense of being watched grew unbearable. Even outside the base, on leave in town, I felt eyes on me. More than once, a black sedan idled near the pubs where soldiers gathered. When I turned to look, it rolled away without headlights. Carlson admitted he had seen the same. We didn't talk about it openly. To speak too much was to risk attention, and attention was dangerous. But each of us carried the same knowledge. We were not free men anymore. We were witnesses, and that made us property. What struck me hardest was the realization that Rendlesham was not unique. The more I listened, the more I read, the more I understood. Others had stood where we stood. Pilots in Vietnam chased lights that outpaced them. Naval crews reported objects rising from the ocean, dripping water, only to vanish into sky at impossible speed. Farmers in South America described triangular crafts, silent and immense, hovering above their fields. Always the same, always denied, always buried. Patterns emerged. Roswell, Wright-Patterson, Rendlesham, different places, different decades, but the same story told in different tongues. And I began to suspect that the real secret wasn't the phenomena themselves. It was a coordination of silence that followed. And if silence was coordinated, then the truth wasn't chaos. It was control. That thought chilled me more than the memory of the craft itself. Because if they could control silence, what else could they control? Decades later, I still struggle to find the right words. People ask what happened in Rendlesham, and I wish I could give them a clean answer. A beginning, a middle, an end. But the truth doesn't fit into neat boxes. It never did. Because the real story of Rendlesham isn't only about what we saw in the forest. It's about what came after. The silence, the surveillance, the way men broke under the weight of secrets they were never allowed to share. For some, the burden became too heavy. Ramirez left the service not long after, disappearing into civilian life. I tried to track him down once, years later, but no one seemed to know where he had gone. Some whispered he drank too much, that he wanted nothing to do with anyone from those days. Carlson stayed longer, but the fire in him dimmed. Last I heard, he rarely spoke of the Air Force at all. Peniston carried his notebooks, those endless strings of binary, into the rest of his life, debated by researchers and skeptics alike. Burroughs struggled with health problems that no doctor could explain. And me, I carried the symbols. I tried to live a normal life. Family, work, the rhythm of days that should have felt ordinary. But the symbols never left. They came in dreams, in waking flashes, in compulsions I couldn't resist. My notebooks piled up, filled with glyphs I still don't understand. Sometimes in the dead of night, I flip through them and feel a strange familiarity, as though I am looking not at drawings, but at memories. The world outside moved on. Roswell became legend. Rendlesham became a trivia question for late-night talk shows. Skeptics laughed, believers clung, and the truth remained somewhere in between. Untouchable, unprovable, yet undeniable. And yet, every few years, another story breaks. Pilots speaking on record about lights that outmaneuvered their jets. Naval crews releasing videos of objects moving faster than physics should allow. Whistleblowers hinting at recovered materials, at programs hidden behind layers of classification. Each time, the pattern repeats. Revelation, ridicule, silence. I used to think the hardest part was the fear. That night in the forest, the hum in the air, the impossible craft hovering above us. But fear fades. What never fades is doubt. Doubt that corrodes you from within. Doubt planted by people who smile as they tell you to forget your own eyes. And still, the symbols remain. Sometimes, when the house is quiet and I sit alone at my desk, I spread the notebooks before me. The lamp casts a small circle of light, and outside the window, the stars hang silent. And in those moments, I almost feel them again, the hum, the silence, the sense of something vast pressing against the edges of the world. I wonder if the symbols are meant to be solved, or if they are simply meant to be carried, a burden passed from witness to witness, generation to generation, until one day they find their place. I wonder if the forest chose us, or if we were simply unlucky. And I wonder if the truth has ever really been hidden, or if it has always been in plain sight, scattered across the testimonies of men and women who stood where they should not have stood, who saw what they should not have seen, who carried what they could never put down. So I leave you with this question, the same one that has haunted me since 1980. If knowledge greater than yourself is forced upon you, knowledge you cannot fully understand or escape, do you call it a gift, or do you call it a curse? I still don't know the answer. I only know this. The night in Rendlesham never ended. Not for me. Not for any of us. And maybe not for the world. It has been decades since that night in Rendlesham, and still the memory refuses to fade. The world around the forest has changed, but the night itself has not. The forest itself looks different now. Some trees have been cleared, tourist paths have been marked with signs, and even guideposts have been erected to point the curious toward the so-called UFO trail. What was once a place of silence and secrecy has been packaged for curiosity, for entertainment, for casual hikers who walk where we once stood in fear. They come in groups, with cameras dangling from their necks, backpacks filled with snacks, and children laughing as they take selfies beside plaques that describe what we lived through as if it were folklore. They walk the same soil where our boots sank into the mud, but for them, it is just another weekend excursion. Sometimes I wonder if that is the final victory of secrecy, not the erasure of the truth, but its transformation into myth, a story stripped of its weight, reduced to something safe, something consumable, a tale to be repeated around campfires or sold in gift shops. It becomes history written not in blood or fear, but in tourist brochures and magazine articles. Yet for those of us who were there, it was never entertainment. It was as real as the cold mud beneath our boots, as sharp as the heat radiating from the craft hull, as unforgettable as the symbols that burned themselves into our minds. The world calls it the Rendlesham Forest Incident. Those words feel small. They reduce an encounter with the impossible to a label, a convenient title that allows people to believe they understand. But no title can capture what it was like to stand in a forest suffocated by silence, staring at a machine or perhaps a presence that belonged to no nation on earth. Over the years, official documents have been released. Freedom of Information requests pried open files that once sat locked in steel cabinets. In those pages, the reports remain cautious, clinical, stripped of weight. Unexplained lights observed. No threat detected. The words are paper-thin compared to the enormity of what we experienced. They describe impressions in the soil, radiation levels slightly above normal, and unusual damage to tree trunks. All the facts are there, but none of them capture the silence that seemed alive, the electricity that made your skin crawl, the terror of facing something beyond human. Facts without the heartbeat of truth. Colonel Halt's tape surfaced too. I remember the first time I heard outside official channels. His voice was calm yet tense, narrating the events as they unfolded. Lights darting in the trees, beams striking the ground, instruments failing in his hands. For anyone willing to listen, it is undeniable evidence. A career officer, trained to be precise and methodical, was describing the impossible in measured tones. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't panicked. He was documenting. And yet, even with his voice preserved on magnetic tape, the official stance never wavered. Misidentified stars, a distant lighthouse, flares from routine training. To accept the testimony of those who were there would mean accepting a reality far larger than military protocol could contain. But memory does not bend to protocol. Some of us spoke years later, each in our own way. Jim Penniston revealed his notebook, the one he had filled after touching the craft. Pages covered in binary sequences written in a state between trance and duty. Researchers claim the code translated into coordinates for sacred sites scattered across the globe, places of ancient mystery, megalithic structures, even locations linked to myths of otherworldly visitors. Skeptics dismissed it as coincidence, the desperate search for meaning in random scratches. Perhaps, but if it was coincidence, it was a strange one, born from the hand of a soldier who swore he had never studied binary in his life. John Burroughs came forward as well. He sought medical treatment for conditions that doctors linked to unusual radiation exposure. The government resisted him, denied responsibility, fought his claims at every turn. And yet, years later, compensation was quietly granted. Why would compensation be issued if nothing had happened? Why admit to harm caused by something officially dismissed as a lighthouse? And then there are the countless others, men in uniform across decades and continents, who whisper of objects defying physics, of lights tracking their aircraft, of silences imposed upon them. Their stories mirror ours so closely that it feels impossible to believe they are unconnected. Different bases, different skies, different men, but the same impossible encounters, always followed by silence. Looking back now, I see Rendlesham not as an isolated night, but as a thread in a much larger tapestry. A tapestry woven with secrecy, denial, and glimpses of a truth too vast to be contained. The Cold War ended. Enemies shifted. Decades passed, yet the silence remained. And here's a question that gnaws at me still. If governments across the world hold fragments of the same secret, if military witnesses have carried the same burden for generations, what does that say about what lies beyond our skies? Would you want to know, even if it shattered your understanding of safety, of control, of what it means to be human? Or would you rather look away, comforted by the illusion that the unknown does not exist? For me, there has never been the option of looking away. The older I get, the more I realize that Rendlesham was never meant to be contained within the boundaries of a single forest in Suffolk. What we lived that night was part of a current that has been flowing for decades, perhaps centuries, moving just beneath the surface of official history. In the years after, I followed the stories that slipped through the cracks. Pilots from the Vietnam War spoke, in hushed tones, about lights that paced their jets at impossible speeds. Submarine crews whispered about objects rising silently from the ocean, vanishing into the sky, without leaving a ripple behind. Farmers in South America, miners in Africa, fishermen in the Pacific, all described the same silent presence, the same impossible craft. Different accents, different details, but the same core truth. The press treated these accounts as curiosities. Some mocked them, others treated them as ghost stories for a skeptical age. But for those of us who had stood in Rendlesham, these stories were not curiosities. They were proof. Proof that what we saw was not confined to one place or one night. And yet, with every revelation came the same response: denial, ridicule, silence. I sometimes think the silence is more dangerous than the encounter itself. Fear is temporary. It grips you, shakes you, then fades when the moment passes. Silence, however, lingers. It eats at you, corrodes your certainty, forces you to question whether the truth you carry is real or imagined. And when that silence is enforced by authority, by men in suits with files, by superiors with orders, it becomes more than doubt. It becomes control. I've read the declassified documents, the Freedom of Information releases, the reports typed in neat military language. They talk about no threat detected, about lights of unknown origin. They acknowledge impressions in the soil, elevated radiation, scorched trees. And yet, all of it is framed in a way that invites dismissal. The language is careful, stripped of weight, facts without meaning, data without context. It's as if the truth was dissected into pieces so small that no one could ever see the whole. What those documents never capture is the human cost. Burroughs fought for years just to have his medical conditions recognized. Radiation exposure. They finally admitted, but they never connected it to the night in the forest, at least not openly. And yet, he received compensation. Why compensate a man for something that officially never happened? Peniston carried his notebook like a wound that never healed. Page after page of binary, written in a state of compulsion. He said it poured from him, unstoppable, as though his hand had become a conduit for something larger. Researchers argued endlessly. Some saying it was nonsense, others insisting it translated into coordinates pointing to sacred sites across the globe. I've seen those translations myself. Machu Picchu, the pyramids, the Nazca lines. Coincidence, perhaps, or perhaps something else entirely. And I know what some will say, that it's imagination, that the human mind is desperate for patterns, that we create meaning where none exists. But I stood in that forest. I saw the symbols blaze on the hull of that craft. I felt them burn into my mind like fire pressed against skin. And when I see the pages of Peniston's notebook, I feel the same pulse I felt that night, the rhythm of something alive. As the years passed, others came forward too. Retired officers, pilots long out of service, men who no longer feared losing their careers. They spoke of objects that defied gravity, of instruments that went haywire, of orders to remain silent. The details varied, but the patterns were the same, always the same. And with every testimony, I felt both vindication and despair. Vindication, because I knew we were not alone in carrying this burden. Despair, because it proved how long the silence had been enforced, how deep the system of denial ran. It is easy for outsiders to treat these things as legends, as curiosities for late-night radio or television specials. But for us, it was life. It was health, careers, sanity. I have seen men broken by the weight of what they carried. I have seen them drink too much, withdraw from friends, lose themselves in obsessions they could not explain. The craft did not just leave marks on the soil. It left marks on us. And sometimes I wonder if that was the point. Because Rendlesham did not feel like an accident. It did not feel random. It felt deliberate, as though we had been chosen, plucked from the routine of duty, and thrust into something vast. And if that is true, then the question becomes, why us? Why that forest, on that night, with those men? I do not have the answer. Perhaps I never will. But the silence ensures that the question never leaves me. The strangest part about Rendlesham is not that it happened, but how quickly it was transformed into something safe. The forest that once swallowed our fear has been repackaged into a walking trail, a tourist attraction. Plaques describe sightings, brochures speak of mysteries, and families take weekend trips along paths marked with playful alien symbols. It has become folklore, domesticated and declawed. I have walked that trail myself, years later, long after I left the service. I saw children laugh as they posed for photographs, pointing at cartoon depictions of flying saucers. I saw tourists studying the information boards as if they were reading about a local legend no more serious than Robin Hood. And the whole time, I felt a weight pressing against me, as though the silence of that December night was still there, buried beneath layers of trivialization. That is how secrets survive, not through erasure, but through dilution. When the truth becomes folklore, it is dismissed not because it is forgotten, but because it is no longer feared. But I cannot forget and I cannot laugh. The documents released under Freedom of Information laws only deepen the divide. The reports describe unusual lights, no significant threat, soil impressions consistent with possible landing gear. They reduce the extraordinary to sterile data. And yet, hidden within those files, there are details that align too perfectly with what we lived. Elevated radiation readings, scorched tree trunks, the triangular pattern in the soil. The reports confirm everything except the meaning. And that is the point. Facts without meaning cannot threaten authority. What the files omit is what matters most. The silence, the way the air itself seemed alive, charged with something that pressed against the body. The way the forest felt as though it were holding its breath. The way time itself seemed to bend, minutes stretching into hours as the craft hovered above us. These are not things that can be measured with instruments, yet they are the essence of what we experienced. Then there is Colonel Halt's tape. I have listened to it many times since it surfaced. His voice is steady, professional, reporting as he was trained to do. He describes lights darting through the trees, beams striking the ground, instruments failing one after another. On the tape you can hear the tension, the controlled urgency of a man trained never to exaggerate. And yet his words are clear. Something extraordinary was there. If a man like Halt could not convince the world, what chance did the rest of us have? Even when Penniston revealed his notebook, the reception was divided. Skeptics dismissed the binary as nonsense. Others swore it translated into coordinates for ancient sites across the planet. Machu Picchu, the pyramids of Giza, the Nazca lines. Coincidence, they said. But how could a man with no training in binary produce such sequences under compulsion? How could he describe, years before GPS was widely available, locations that resonated with centuries of mystery? And then there was Burroughs. His fight for medical recognition stretched for decades. Radiation exposure, they finally admitted, but never linked officially to Rendlesham. Compensation was granted quietly, without ceremony, without acknowledgement, as if money could erase the truth, as if silence could be bought. But the silence was not just ours. Across the ocean, pilots reported lights pacing their jets. Naval crews described objects emerging from the sea. Farmers and villagers across the world told of triangular craft hovering silently above them. Always the same patterns. Always followed by denial. And through it all, Roswell remained the great shadow, the grandfather of all UFO stories, dismissed officially yet never fully erased. The same pattern appeared there. Strange debris, witnesses silenced, explanations that shifted with the years. First a weather balloon, then a test project. Always the same dance of denial. Always the same smirk from officials who insisted nothing had happened. To me, the parallels are undeniable. Rendlesham was not unique. It was a continuation, a chapter in a story that began long before us and continues long after. But here's a question that haunts me. If the truth has been managed so carefully, diluted into folklore, then what does that say about those who manage it? Is the secrecy meant to protect us? Or is it meant to protect themselves? Because I cannot escape the suspicion that what we saw in Rendlesham was not an accident. That night felt deliberate, as if we had been allowed to glimpse something we were never meant to touch. And if that is true, then the story of Rendlesham is not about a craft in a forest. It is about control. Control of memory. Control of truth. Control of fear. And the forest, packaged now for tourists, remains a stage where that control still lingers. There are nights when I wake drenched in sweat, certain that I am still standing in the forest. The years dissolve, and I am once again 20-something, mud on my boots, breath caught in my chest, staring at a craft that should not exist. In those dreams, the silence returns first, the heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press down on the trees themselves. Then the lights come, pulsing red to white to blue, shimmering across the bark of oaks. And always at the end, the symbols flare. They rearrange themselves in my mind, twisting and folding, alive. I used to think they were only dreams. But after Rendlesham, dreams never felt safe again. Some men learned to bury the memory. Ramirez never spoke of it after leaving the service. Carlson tried to drown it in routine, volunteering for every duty until exhaustion left him no room to think. Burroughs fought with doctors, with the government, with his own failing health. And Penniston, he carried the burden on paper, filling notebook after notebook with codes that seemed to come from somewhere beyond him. As for me, The symbols became a shadow I could never outrun. At first, I tried to resist. I refused to keep writing them, refused to give in to the compulsion. But the more I resisted, the more they crept in. I saw them in the corners of my vision, in cracks on the wall, in the patterns of branches against the sky. They followed me into waking life, demanding to be acknowledged. Eventually, I surrendered. The notebooks piled up, each filled with glyphs and fragments I could not interpret. Sometimes I would lose hours, staring at the pages, convinced the meaning was just out of reach. Other times I feared that there was no meaning at all, that the act of writing was a meaning, that I had become part of a process I could not understand. I wondered often if the craft had left something behind in us, not just memories, not just radiation burns, but something deeper, a seed, an imprint, a fragment of itself woven into our minds. Peniston once described it as a download. That word unsettled me, yet it felt right. Information pressed into us, not through language but through presence, carried like a virus that could never be expelled. Perhaps the symbols were not messages for us to read, but instructions waiting for their moment. If that sounds paranoid, it is because Rendlesham left paranoia as its legacy. Every knock at the door, every letter opened late, every phone call with too much static. I wondered if it was connected. Were we being watched, studied, or was the real experiment internal, measured by how long the memories would shape us? And still, the world outside trivialized it. Television specials framed Rendlesham as folklore. Documentaries added dramatic music, but never captured the silence. Late-night talk shows use it as punchline material. Tourists laugh along the UFO trail, their footsteps erasing the weight of our boots in the mud. But there were moments when the truth pierced through. In America, naval pilots released footage of objects moving at impossible speeds, captured on infrared cameras. In South America, farmers described the same triangular crafts that haunted my dreams. In Russia, declassified reports spoke of encounters eerily similar to ours. And each time I felt the same chill. Different skies, different nations, same silence. Patterns cannot be coincidence forever. Sometimes I ask myself whether the secrecy is meant to protect us from panic, or whether it protects those who already know more than we ever will. If governments admit that objects exist which defy our physics, our weapons, our control, then power itself becomes fragile. Perhaps that is a real secret, not the existence of the craft, but the admission of powerlessness. And yet, powerless is what we felt that night. Powerless to understand, powerless to act, powerless to forget. What remains, decades later, is not fear but weight. A weight I cannot put down, no matter how many years pass. And perhaps that was the point all along. Decades have passed, and still Rendlesham refuses to release me. I am older now, gray where once it was youth, my hands slower, my breath shorter. And yet when I close my eyes, I am back in that forest. The air tastes the same, metallic, charged, electric. The silence is the same, oppressive, alive, suffocating. And the symbols still glow, shifting behind my eyelids as though no time at all has passed. I sometimes wonder whether memory is the true prison. Perhaps the craft itself left the forest long ago, but what it imprinted in us remains, looping endlessly. Others moved on, at least outwardly. Ramirez vanished into civilian life, silent to the end. Carlson buried it under layers of denial, though I suspect it never left him. Burroughs fought a battle that no soldier should have to fight, against his own government for recognition of wounds no one wanted to admit existed. Peniston carried his notebooks into history, debated endlessly by skeptics and believers. And me, I carried the silence. The world around Rendlesham has transformed. Tourists walk the UFO trail, laughing where we once trembled. Children pose beside signs with little green men painted on them. The truth has been diluted into folklore, sanitized into entertainment. I sometimes think that is the most effective form of secrecy, not to erase, but to ridicule. If the story becomes a joke, the truth inside it is buried deeper than any locked file could hide. But history has a strange way of circling back. Each decade brings new revelations, new witnesses, new cracks in the wall of silence. Pilots releasing footage of objects their radars cannot track. naval officers describing crafts diving into oceans, whistleblowers hinting at programs hidden behind layers of classification. Always the same pattern: revelation, denial, ridicule, silence. And always the same symbols, repeated across the testimonies of men who never knew each other. Sometimes I think the forest chose us. That night in 1980 was not an accident, not a random alignment of men and machine. It was deliberate, a hand extended from the unknown, pressing against the edge of our world just long enough to leave its mark. Why us? Why there? Why then? These are questions I cannot answer. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I know that the silence of Rendlesham was not absence, but presence. Something watching, something waiting, something that has not gone away. And so I ask you, as you hear these words, if knowledge beyond comprehension were placed in your hands, knowledge that shattered the boundaries of science, faith, and power, would you embrace it, or would you cling to the comfort of ignorance? For me, there is no ignorance left, only the weight of memory. Sometimes, late at night, I sit at my desk under the glow of a single lamp, my notebook spread before me. Outside the window, the stars hang still, and in their silence I feel the forest return. The hum, the glow, the impossible craft pressing against the edges of the world. And I wonder if it is waiting still, patient and watchful, for another night, another witness, another Rendlesham. Perhaps the forest is not finished. Perhaps the silence is not done speaking. And perhaps one day the truth will no longer need us to carry it in whispers. Until then, I remain what I was that night, a witness. Nothing more, nothing less.